Hi everybody, I'm Natalie Bovis from the Liquid Muse, and today we're talking about Irish whiskey. The word whiskey is believed to come from the old Irish term ishkabah. So when we taste, we want to sip 2 times. So if you're tasting with me at home, pour a little bit of Irish whiskey. The first thing we're going to do is we taste with our eyes first. So we see this lovely kind of amber color that comes from the wood barrels. Irish whiskey must be aged about 3 years, minimum actually. So that lovely rich brownish color comes from the wood barrels. The next thing we do is we taste with our nose. Oh my goodness, there is just a beautiful kind of grainy aroma. Irish whiskey is typically, is made from barley, and sometimes it's blended with other kinds of grains. So of course you're going to get a lot of this grainy kind of walking into a field of growing grains, or if you've been to a brewery, even that kind of a smell of grains and yeasty and those kind of rich, almost baking type aromas. And then we taste with our mouth. And so we're going to take 2 sips. The first sip of the whiskey is just going to sort of clean out the mouth. And you can either spit that out if you don't want to get too tipsy too quickly at home, or you can drink it. So I'm going to do my first sip now. Now you notice I let that swish all around my mouth and clean out anything I had before. Now, after I've drunk that whiskey, I'm going to breathe in with my mouth and feel this really cool sensation. That's the alcohol. And then now I'm going to breathe out through my nose. And I get a lot more flavor. You'll see what I mean when you try this yourself. So now I'm going to do my second taste, where I'm going to take a bit of the whiskey. I'm going to hold it in my mouth. I'm going to drink it. I'm going to breathe in and see what's kind of lingering, and then out through my nose, and then see what further flavors actually come through the exhalation of the air through the nose. So if you did this along with me with whichever kind of Irish whiskey you're tasting, you probably will get some of that kind of a little bit of sweetness, which comes from the grain and also from the wood. A little bit of caramel, butterscotch, that comes from oak. So I'm going to be assuming this is aged in oak barrels. Probably some other barrels. Actually, it says on the bottle, I'm tasting Slane. I mean, I'm not pushing a brand. This is just the one I'm tasting today that I like, which actually is also aged in some sherry barrels, I believe. So there's probably a bit of residue of that. There's an innate sweetness, which is not added sugar. Irish whiskey should not have sugar added to it. It's just a straight spirit. But some of that sweetness comes from the grains, from the blends, from the wood itself. When I breathe out, I got almost like an oatmeal, like a nice sort of rich aroma that came on that sort of what I call the second tasting through the nose exhalation. So this technique that I've just gone through with you is a great way to taste all spirits, whether you're tasting vodka, gin, any kind of whiskey, rum, cognacs or brandies, different brandies, anything that you're tasting. Different kinds of whiskeys, and we're going to get into that in just a minute. This class is focusing on Irish whiskey, so let's taste a little. Okay, let's talk whiskey. So whiskey is a big category, and there are all different kinds of whiskey. There is Irish, which we'll be covering today. There's Scotch, which is made obviously in the same region, and Scotch is made from malted barley. Some of the differences between Scotch and Irish whiskey are that Scotch typically, and of course I'm generalizing here, but the way it's made is often will have a little bit more of a smokiness, a peatiness, and that just has to do with the way the spirit is treated, or even the grain is treated before it is fermented and distilled. Whereas Irish whiskey is characterized by having a bit more of a sort of silky, elegant, smooth taste. Now, there are different styles of Scotch and Irish whiskey, but those are some of like the key characteristics that you can be looking for when you're tasting for a difference. Let's hop across the Atlantic. There's Canadian whiskey, which is pretty rye heavy a lot of the time, and that will usually be a blended whiskey. And then we have rye whiskey, which was probably the first whiskey made in the New World, in the colonies, because rye grows up in the northeastern part of the US. It was readily available to people moving there from Europe in the 1700s. Which takes us down to bourbon. The settlers that came to what is now the United States, they were moving sort of south and west and kind of exploring North America. And when they sort of arrived, I guess we could say, in the Kentucky area, what's today Kentucky, around the 1700s, there was quite an influx of settlers to that region. And of course, corn was growing quite well already. It is a native plant to North America. And so down there, they were making corn whiskey. So bourbon today must be at least 51% corn in order to be bourbon. It does not have to be made in Kentucky. Bourbon can be made and is made in almost all of the United States. Or I think actually all of the states have their own bourbon. But it must be at least 51% corn and aged for a minimum of 2 years in charred new oak barrels. Also, Bourbon County does exist in Kentucky, named after the French royal family, the Bourbon family back in France. And that was sort of a nod to the French help when the colonists were fighting the British in the Civil War, because France helped America get liberty from England. And so a whole bunch of history in bourbon. That's another class. There's also Japanese whiskey. So this is a really interesting spirit. Actually, Japanese people, Japanese whiskey drinkers, were really enamored with Scotch and decided to create their own, so some distilleries did their own sort of Scotch there, where they were malting barley, and then even some went so far as to import water from Scotland to blend with the spirit that they were making in Japan. So let's see, am I missing any? I'm sure I am. There's all sorts of whiskeys made all over the world, but those are a few of sort of like the big categories within the enormous category of whiskey spirits, so that we can start to get our bearings of where we're starting, and then we're going to narrow in a little bit more. This is probably where we should begin at the beginning, which is fermentation and distillation. If you've had classes with me before, this might be a little bit repetitive, so I'll go through it relatively quickly. Fermentation happens when yeast eats sugar, and the byproduct of that, I say eats, converts sugar into alcohol and gives off carbon dioxide. So if you've been to a brewery or a distillery, you'll see that everything begins in the fermentation tank. And so anything, I say brewery because grains, when fermented into a liquid, create a beer. Fruit, when fermented, will create a wine. So in breweries, you'll smell that grainy, almost like bread baking smell, which is the yeast and the grains interacting with one another. So brewers will add yeast, or distillers will start with brewing. They'll add yeast strains. Now today we've gotten very selective. Yeast occurs, the bacteria occurs naturally in the air. But of course, now it's very scientific, and they have identified the kinds of yeast that will yield the sorts of results they want, just like in winemaking. So we'll ferment the grains. When that liquid is collected, the next step in making whiskey is to distill it. So The first stills were pot stills or alembic stills. So a pot still, I'm going to explain this in a very simplistic way. There's a lot more to it, but for the sake of this class, it'll be very sort of easy to understand. So we'll have one pot, let's say a big copper pot, and put the beer into that, the fermented grain water. And there'll be another empty pot on the side of it, and there might be a cap on the first pot with a tube that goes to the second pot. That first pot will be heated, and the heat will create a sort of vapor or steam, right? That'll rise out of that water, out of that fermented liquid. And alcohol rises more quickly than water. So that vapor coming off, the spirit lifting off the liquid, if you will be then going up, captured in the cap, go through the cooling tube where it reconfigures itself as liquid and drips into the other pot, which is not heated and is collecting that pure alcohol. They're extracting the pure alcohol out of the fermented liquid. The alcohol was created by the yeast eating the sugar, right? So that alcohol goes up, it cools, it reliquefies, and what you have in the other pot is pure alcohol. What happens next, of course, is that will be blended with water to bring it down to proof. What that means is the alcohol coming right off that process is extremely high in alcohol and methane and all kinds of things that are not good for humans. So it's blended down to, typically most spirits are going to be 40% alcohol or 80 proof. Some are a bit higher, but again, we're speaking in the very standard terms here. Blended with water down to so that it can be fit for human consumption. All alcohol, no matter which spirit we're talking about, is clear when it comes off the still. All of it looks like water, and it gets its color from the wood barrels that it is then aged in. And so in most cases, or traditionally, these would be aged in oak barrels. However, today, many distillers, whether we're talking about tequila or scotch or bourbon, or, well, actually bourbon's always in charred new oak barrels, so forget bourbon, but Irish whiskey, tequila, different kinds of brandies and whatnot, the distillers are starting to play with the different kinds of wood. And so sometimes they're aged also, as well as being aged in oak barrels, sometimes they'll age some part in a sherry barrel or a wine barrel or some other kind of Madeira, fortified wine barrel, and then blend them and get different flavors from the wood, which is a really interesting thing. So when you go to the liquor store and you want to try a new kind of Irish whiskey or a new kind of tequila or anything else that you like, talk with the people there who are working there and see if they can give you a little bit more information about. All that talking has made me thirsty. What about you? Let's make our first cocktail. This class is part hands-on workshop. And the first drink I think would be fun to try is what I'm calling an Irish whiskey martini. It's kind of a Manhattan, it's kind of a martini. You'll see what I mean. Let's get stirring. into the popularity of Irish whiskey. Irish whiskey's been made for over 1,000 years. It actually was brought to Ireland by monks who had traveled from Ireland to mainland Europe, and that's where they learned the art of distillation. Now, they had learned it more for perfumes and for medicinal remedies, which actually was brought to Europe by the Arabic culture, by the Moors. Arabic culture for thousands of years had some kind of distillation. If you think about Cleopatra and the ancient Egypt, we see depictions of this kind of coal eyeliner, and some of that is made through distillation techniques, as well as perfumes and other kind of very advanced medicines that the Arabic world had been using for a long time. When the Moors moved up into the Iberian Peninsula, they brought with them this distillation technique, if you will. And so people there had already, of course, the Romans and the Greeks and all of these ancient civilizations in Europe had already been drinking wine for millennia. And so it's thought that probably the first distillate made for an alcoholic beverage to drink, a distilled spirit, would have been some kind of a brandy, because brandy is distilled wine. Okay, back to whiskey. So the monks from Ireland had gone to mainland Europe. They come back to Ireland. They learn distillation. They bring it with them. They also, like I mentioned, were using it for more not non-recreational purposes. But of course, human beings are human beings. And just like what was happening in other parts of Europe, they start distilling beer, right? The fermented grain beverage. So let's jump ahead several centuries and let's talk about the 1800s. So, I mentioned earlier when we're talking about the settlers leaving Europe and coming to America, or what we now call America, they, of course, were bringing with them the things that they like to eat and drink, and whiskey was among those, especially with the Irish immigrants. And so Irish whiskey was a huge import at that time. And in fact, Irish whiskey was probably the most widely drunk whiskey in the world in the 1800s. It was really very, very popular. Let's get into the 1900s and, of course, what happens in America. From 1920 to 1933, Prohibition. So during that time, all imports of alcohol stopped. Prior to that, the Americans, or the people who were, settling this area, were drinking rum, they were drinking gin, they were drinking whiskeys of all sorts, cognacs and different brandies from France and Spain. Of course, there were spirits being made here, like bourbon and whatnot, but Prohibition had a huge impact on trade. And so there was a huge decline on anything that would have been imported from Europe, obviously. And Irish whiskey kind of just fell off the map for most of the 1900s. And so it actually fell off the map so much, not only here, but also was drunk less in Europe and other parts of the world for most of the 1900s as well. And when we come to 2010, which was, well into this resurgence of mixology, right? 2010 was a year where, mixology had been talked about, old spirits, old cocktails, old ways of doing things had kind of come back to being in vogue. At that point, there were probably just a handful of Irish distilleries that had kind of weathered, all these years. Just maybe 2, 3, 4 making whiskey at that time. And today, I'm recording this in 2023, there are easily over 30, probably 40 Irish distilleries that are cranking out beautiful Irish spirits, and Irish whiskey is again back in favor. And there's no reason why it would have gone out of favor, really, other than just all of this sort of, political turmoil in the US with Prohibition and whatnot, and then other spirits post-Prohibition, post-World War II, making their way in to American drinking, at least. As I talk about cocktail culture and Irish whiskey, I would be remiss not to mention the Dead Rabbit in New York, in Manhattan. It's a bar that was opened around 2014. I have to double check that, but around there, 2014, 2015, by Jack McGarry and Sean Muldoon, who were Irish bartenders back in Ireland and came over to New York. And they had a huge impact on cocktail culture and certainly brought back a lot of interest in Irish whiskey, Irish pubs. I believe they have their own Irish whiskey too. And one of the quintessential cocktails, if you will, that people will have there is an Irish coffee. So our next cocktail hands-on demonstration is going to be just that. It's my version, but I highly encourage you, if you go to the Dead Rabbit or if you go to any other Irish pub in Ireland or elsewhere, to give one a try. Let's talk about a few different kinds of Irish whiskey. There's the single malt Irish whiskey. So this is made from only malted barley. I was saying earlier that Irish whiskey is often made from unmalted barley, whereas Scotch is always malted barley. So again, within every category, there are many styles, and you can do a deep dive to research further. There's only so much we can cover in this class. So the quick overview is that a single malt Irish whiskey will be all malted barley made at a single distillery. A single pot Irish whiskey can be a mix of both malted and unmalted Irish whiskey, but it will be blended together in one single pot still when it is being stilled. Grain Irish whiskey means that not more than 30% will be malted barley. The rest could be unmalted barley. It could also be blended with wheat or corn or rye, and that's what we would call a grain whiskey. Now, blended whiskey means that any two of the ones I just described are blended together. And then there's a kind of Irish moonshine called poteen. It is, the word pota in Old Irish means pot, so it's made in a pot still. And poteen is something that's sort of a rougher kind of Irish whiskey, which has a really funky, strong flavor. I personally really like that. And I'm excited to share the next recipe with you because it comes from my new book. Came out in January 2023, called Drinking with My Dog. And I'm excited to share that with you because my book, Drinking with My Dog, which came out in January 2023, has a recipe using poteen. It's in the Holidays chapter, and it's under St. Patrick's Day. So in America, we're used to celebrating St. Patrick by drinking green beer and pinching each other and wearing green and all this kind of silly stuff. But St. Patrick actually was a person who was kidnapped from Scotland and sold into slavery in Ireland. And there he worked as a shepherd and had a pretty lonely life where he lived in the mountains with his wolfhounds, with his sheep, and became very close with the dogs who were his friends, really. And one night he had a dream. His favorite dog came to him as an angel and told him that he could escape if he got to the beach. Well, he did just that, and when he got to the beach, he found a boat of pirates who had captured 100 wild dogs and who would not let them back on their ship, so they couldn't leave. And so supposedly, Patrick was able to strike a deal with them that if he could communicate with these dogs and calm them enough to let the pirates reboard, that they would take him to freedom. So the story goes that happened, and he sailed away, and years later he came back, and he back to Ireland, where he actually had been quite religious, and he was able to sort of bring together Christianity and paganism. And the legend also says that he banished all the snakes from Ireland, because there are not snakes in Ireland, which is really nice when you're hiking around there. Do not worry about being bitten by a snake. And hence, became St. Patrick, was canonized. So, that's a really fun legend. Who knows how much is true or not, but I thought it was well worth putting in the book. And now we're going to make the drink from that story. Well, that brings us to the end of our Irish whiskey class for today. I hope you learned a few things along the way, and I hope you had fun making cocktails. And if you would like any more information, you're welcome to email me, natalie@theliquidmuse.com. I look forward to hearing from you, and slàinte.